Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of humanity's greatest talents, coming up with increasingly creative ways to hurt each other when talking no longer works. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I'm not here to lay siege to your village or confiscate your firewood, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Medieval warfare wasn't a noble contest of honour, bravery and mutual respect. That idea mostly exists because centuries later, people who were not there needed something comforting to believe. In reality, medieval combat was a design problem that kept getting worse, like an arms race run by people who had never heard the phrase, "Maybe this is enough." Every battle asked the same question: how do we stop the other person from continuing to exist? Preferably before lunch. At first, swords worked fine. Then armour happened. Lots of armour. More armour every year. Knights kept adding metal plates like they were afraid the enemy might try to hug them too hard. Soon, warriors resembled walking cookware. Confident, loud, and increasingly difficult to deal with. Weapon makers responded the only way they knew how. Panic mixed with creativity. If cutting stopped working, they were crushed. If crushing failed, they punctured. If puncturing didn't solve the issue, they hooked, yanked, tripped, or simply knocked the other person over and let gravity finish the conversation. Medieval engineers did not believe in elegant solutions. They believed in, did it work? Yes or no? And what's impressive or deeply concerning is how fast innovation happened. Someone would show up to a battlefield in thicker armour, and within a few years, everyone else would be carrying a brand new weapon specifically designed to make that armour feel like a bad financial decision. No refunds, no warranty. Blacksmiths experimented constantly. They added spikes because why not? They added chains because rigidity had failed them emotionally. They extended handles so soldiers could maintain a safe emotional distance from the screaming. Every design choice screamed, "I learned this the hard way." This creativity wasn't limited to professionals. Farmers modified tools, hunters repurposed gear. Militia showed up holding things that technically had other jobs last week. If it could transfer force and cause regret, it was weaponized immediately. The battlefield became a testing ground for bad ideas that worked far too well, and once an idea worked, it spread quickly. There were no ethics committees, no safety testing, and no let's think this through. There was only survival, and the quiet hope that whatever you built wouldn't bounce back and hit you. Medieval warfare wasn't poetic. It wasn't romantic. It was iterative design under extreme stress. And every strange, terrifying weapon you're about to see is proof that when humans are cold, scared, and armoured like refrigerators, creativity becomes mandatory. The flail is what happens when medieval weapon designers looked at a perfectly normal stick and thought, "This is far too safe." At its core, the flail is simple: a handle, a chain, and a spiked ball attached at the end. In practice, it is uncontrolled chaos, physics with anger issues, and a complete rejection of personal safety. The logic behind the flail was actually clever. Shields were becoming a problem. Armour was getting thicker. Straight weapons bounced. So someone asked the most medieval question imaginable. What if the weapon didn't stop when it hit something? Enter the chain. The flail could swing around shields, over armour, and occasionally into the face of the person wielding it. Innovation has risks. Unlike swords, the flail had no interest in elegance. There was no graceful fencing, no careful timing, and no polite exchange of blows. You swung it, and the battlefield figured out the rest. The chain absorbed momentum, redirected force, and turned every movement into a surprise. Even experienced fighters never fully knew where the spiked head would land. This kept enemies nervous and allies extremely alert. The flail's biggest strength was psychological. Facing a flail wasn't just dangerous, it was stressful. Shields became unreliable. Armor felt less comforting. Every swing threatened to sneak around defenses like an uninvited guest who knew your schedule. The sound alone, metal rattling as chains snapping through the air, was enough to raise heart rates before contact was even made. Of course, the flail had one tiny flaw. It was just as dangerous to the user. Tight formations are a bad idea. Confined spaces are a worse idea. Swinging too hard. Congratulations, you discovered recoil the medieval way. Many injuries attributed to battlefield accidents were likely flail-related misunderstandings between weapon and owner. This is why flails were never universally adopted. They required space, strength, and the acceptance that sometimes the weapon simply made its own decisions. Not every soldier wanted to gamble their life on an object that behaved like it resented being held. Still, the flail represents medieval creativity perfectly. It wasn't refined, it wasn't safe, but it solved a problem. Shields stopped working quite so well, armor became less reassuring, and chaos was introduced into an already chaotic environment. The flail wasn't designed to be perfect, it was designed to be unpredictable. And in medieval warfare, unpredictability was sometimes the deadliest feature of all. At some point in medieval history, weapon designers collectively gave up on subtlety. Swords weren't cutting it anymore. Literally, armor had become so effective that slicing attacks often resulted in nothing more than a loud clang and an awkward pause where both fighters reconsidered their life choices. And so, the mace was born. A weapon that asked a very simple question. What if we stopped trying to get through the armor and just punished the person inside it? The mace didn't care about sharp edges or elegant technique. It was blunt force trauma with confidence. A solid handle topped with a heavy, often flanged head designed to concentrate force into small areas. You didn't need to pierce armor, you just needed to hit it hard enough that the body underneath filed a formal complaint. Flanges were the real innovation. Instead of a smooth ball that spread impact evenly, flanges focused energy into narrow ridges. This meant more damage, more shock, and more regret per swing. Armor dented, bones cracked. Internal organs learned that helmets were not in fact soundproof. What made the mace especially appealing was its simplicity. No edge to sharpen, no blade to chip, and no complicated technique required. If you could lift it and swing it, you were already qualified. Medieval armies appreciated this efficiency. Training took time, panic did not. The mace also had a deeply psychological effect. Being hit by a sword hurt, but it often came with visible wounds. Being hit by a mace, that left you standing there confused, dizzy, and suddenly questioning why the world was spinning. Knights discovered that surviving a mace strike didn't mean they were fine. It just meant the damage was happening invisibly inside their very expensive armor. Clerics even favored maces, supposedly because they avoided shedding blood. This was technically true in the same way that dropping a piano on someone avoids stabbing them. The end result was still extremely final. Of course, maces had downsides. They were heavy, they required strength, and they weren't particularly inspiring to look at. No one ever gazed upon a mace and thought, "Ah, yes, beauty." But medieval warfare wasn't about aesthetics, it was about efficiency. The mace represented a turning point. Armour was no longer protection, it was packaging, and the mace was the delivery method. If the mace was medieval frustration made solid, the warhammer was frustration given a graduate degree. Weapon designers had already accepted that cutting was overrated and crushing was effective. The warhammer simply refined the idea and added a very clear message. Your armour investment was a mistake. At first glance, the warhammer looks almost polite, smaller than a mace, narrower and less dramatic. But this was not kindness. This was the focus. One side of the head was usually a flat hammer face designed to deliver concentrated blunt force. The other side was often a sharp spike or beak meant to punch into armour, helmets, or joints like a medieval can opener. The genius of the warhammer was its precision. You didn't need to swing wildly. You didn't need dramatic momentum. You needed accuracy. A solid strike to the helmet could scramble thoughts instantly. A blow to the shoulder could numb an entire arm. A well-placed spike could turn a knight's sense of invincibility into immediate panic. Armour wearers quickly learned a hard truth. Protection did not equal safety. Plate armour distributed force, but it did not cancel it. A warhammer didn't slice through metal, it transmitted energy straight through it. The armour stayed intact. The person inside did not. This made warhammers especially popular in close combat. When battles collapsed into chaotic scrums of shouting, slipping, and very poor footing, the warhammer excelled. It was compact, fast, and devastating, and unlike swords, it didn't get stuck or bounce off at the worst possible moment. The spike added insult to injury. It targeted weak points, visors, armpits, joints, and anywhere the armour had to bend. Knights spent years training to move in armour, only to discover that one sharp beak could undo all that effort in a second. Confidence vanished quickly after the first dented helmet. Warhammers also had a psychological advantage. They looked purposeful. This was not a weapon you accidentally carried. If someone approached you with a warhammer, you knew exactly what they intended, and none of it involved discussion. In many ways, the warhammer marked the moment medieval warfare fully embraced physics over tradition. No romance, no ceremony, just leverage, momentum, and the understanding that metal does not stop force. It merely redirects it. For armoured warriors, this was a sobering realization. For warhammer designers, it was a success story. At some point, medieval soldiers collectively realized an important truth. Being close to danger was optional. You didn't actually need to stand face to face with a heavily armoured, angry stranger to solve the problem. You could simply keep them far away and make it their problem instead, and thus the polearm rose to prominence. Polearms were the long-handled multi-tools of medieval warfare. Spears, halberds, glaives, bills. If it had a long stick and something unpleasant attached to the end, it qualified. The design philosophy was simple. Maximize reach, minimize regret. A spear alone already changed everything. Suddenly foot soldiers could threaten knights before the knight's sword even became relevant. A line of spears turned infantry into a moving wall of absolutely not. Horses refused to charge. Armour became irrelevant if you couldn't get close enough to use it. Distance wasn't cowardice, it was strategy with self-respect. Then things escalated. Designers began adding blades, hooks, spikes, and edges to the spearhead turning it into something that could stab, slash, hook, and occasionally ruin a rider's entire afternoon. The halberd, for example, combined an axe blade, a spear point and a hook because one way of causing problems clearly wasn't enough. Polearms were especially effective against knights on horseback. Horses are brave, but they are not stupid. A wall of sharp objects pointed at chest height sends a very clear message. If the horse stopped, the knight stopped. If the knight stopped, gravity took over. Gravity has always been one of medieval warfare's most reliable allies. There was also a morale advantage. Facing a single sword was intimidating. Facing a dozen polearms moving in unison was terrifying. Infantry units trained to keep formation, brace together, and advance slowly. Individual heroics mattered less than collective pressure. Medieval warfare quietly shifted from looking impressive to staying alive. Of course, polearms weren't glamorous. You didn't duel with them. You didn't pose heroically. You stood in line, held your ground, and trusted your neighbours not to panic. It was less romantic and far more effective. In many ways, polearms represented maturity in medieval warfare. Less flair, more practicality, more understanding that distance reduces risk. Polearms didn't promise glory. They promised survival, and in medieval combat that was the most creative weapon of all. The Bector Corben is proof that medieval weapon designers were not done experimenting. They had simply grown more specific. If the warhammer made armour uncomfortable, the Bector Corben made it personal. This was not a general-purpose weapon. This was a targeted complaint delivered at high speed. At first glance, the Bector Corben looks like a warhammer that decided to specialise. One side featured a hammer face for crushing armour. The other side ended in a long curved spike, the crow's beak, designed to puncture, hook, and generally ruin the structural integrity of anything wearing expensive metal. The brilliance of the bow Corben was versatility. You could smash with it. You could puncture with it. And if neither worked immediately, you could hook your opponent and introduce them to the ground, which medieval warfare considered a perfectly acceptable finishing move. Knights spent years learning how to stay mounted, balanced, and dignified, only to be yanked off their horse like a sack of grain. Armour joints were the real targets. Elbows, knees, visors, armpits, and all the places armour had to bend to remain functional. The crow's beak slipped into these gaps with disturbing ease. Suddenly, all that steel protection turned into a very expensive trap you were stuck inside. The Bector Corben also excelled at intimidation. There is something deeply unsettling about being approached by someone holding a long pole topped with a hammer on one side and a curved spike on the other. It looked less like a weapon and more like a medieval instructional tool titled "How This Ends." And unlike swords, the Bector Corben didn't require elegance. It required intent. You didn't fence with it. You advanced, selected a target, and applied force until the situation resolved itself. Training mattered, but enthusiasm mattered more. This weapon thrived in the later medieval period when plate armour reached its peak. Knights were well protected, confident. Everyone had feet. Everyone needed them. Medieval designers understood this deeply and leaned into it without hesitation. There was no romance in Calrops, no dramatic charge, no heroic clash, just a sudden, sharp realization that the ground itself had turned against you. Many battles were delayed, redirected, or abandoned simply because advancing safely was no longer possible. In a strange way, caltrops represent medieval warfare at its most honest. No speeches, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the best way to win is to make movement impossible. Calrips didn't kill you directly, they just made sure you couldn't run when everything else tried to. And in medieval warfare that was often worse. If the mace was medieval, blunt force trauma in its purest form, the Morning Star was that same idea after someone said, "But what if we added spikes for emphasis?" The result was a weapon that took everything uncomfortable about being hit with a mace, and made it emotionally discouraging as well. At first glance, the Morning Star looks almost decorative. A metal ball covered in spikes attached to a handle like some sort of violent ornament. This is misleading. The spikes were not for style. They were there to ensure that even armour that survived the initial impact still had regrets afterward. The logic was brutally simple. A smooth mace head distributed force evenly, which was great for crushing bones, but occasionally allowed armour to do its job too well. The Morning Star corrected this by concentrating impact into smaller, angrier points. Instead of spreading the force, it focused it. Armour dented deeper, padding compressed harder. Whatever was underneath learned an important lesson about consequences. Morning Stars also had a psychological edge. Spikes do something to the human brain. A plain metal ball says, "This will hurt." A spiked one says, "This will hurt." And I enjoyed designing it. Facing a Morning Star was unsettling in a way that went beyond physics. It looked personal. Unlike flails, most Morning Stars were rigid. No chain, no chaos, no surprise recoil. This made them safer for the user and more predictable in information fighting. You could swing with confidence knowing the weapon wasn't going to come back and demand an apology afterward. They were also durable. No delicate edges, no sharpening, no maintenance beyond. Is it still heavy and covered in spikes? If yes, you were good to go. Medieval armies appreciated weapons that survived abuse, weather, and occasional misuse by people who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Morning Stars found their place, especially in close combat, where space was limited and panic was plentiful. A single swing could knock an opponent off balance, crack armour, and instantly drain morale. Even if the enemy survived, they rarely wanted to continue the conversation. In many ways, the Morning Star represented medieval escalation. Maces worked. So, someone asked how to make them worse. The answer was spikes. Always spikes. The Morning Star wasn't subtle. It wasn't elegant. It was a reminder that medieval creativity often followed one rule. If it works, add spikes and try again. If handheld weapons were medieval creativity on a personal level, siege weapons were creativity scaled up until it required math, teamwork, and a worrying lack of empathy. At some point, medieval armies looked at fortified cities, thick walls, tall towers, smug defenders, and decided the solution was to throw buildings at buildings, enter siege engines. Trebuchets, mangonels, and ballistas weren't just weapons, they were statements. They said, "We don't want to fight you, we want your wall to stop existing." And if that wall happened to be attached to a city, that was simply collateral inconvenience. The trebuchet was the star of the show. Powered by gravity and an unholy amount of patience. It could hurl massive stones over long distances with terrifying accuracy. Watching one operate was like witnessing physics lose its temper. Crews carefully adjusted angles, counterweights and release points. Also, a single rock could fly through the air and politely remove a section of masonry. But stones were only the beginning. Medieval armies quickly realised that fear travelled farther than rocks. So they launched burning materials, diseased animal carcasses, and occasionally very loud messages in the form of whatever was lying around. Nothing says, "Please surrender," like a decomposing cow landing in your courtyard. Ballistas, essentially oversized crossbows, delivered bolts the size of tree trunks. These weren't meant for precision duels. They were meant to punch through gates, towers and morale simultaneously. Mangonels hurled stone with less finesse but more enthusiasm, proving that accuracy was optional when momentum was impressive enough. Siege weapons changed warfare by shifting combat from personal bravery to industrial persistence. You didn't win by skill alone. You won by outlasting, outthinking and outbuilding your enemy. Sieges could last weeks or months, grinding down defenders psychologically long before walls actually fell. And here's the truly creative part. Most siege engines were built on site. Armies showed up with tools, timber and instructions, then constructed enormous weapons within sight of the people they planned to use them on. Imagine watching your enemy assemble a machine specifically designed to destroy your home. That's medieval confidence. Siege warfare wasn't elegant. It was slow, brutal, and deeply uncomfortable, but it worked. Walls cracked, cities surrendered, and medieval engineers proved that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't something you held in your hands. It was something that reshaped the battlefield entirely. Siege weapons didn't just attack defences, they attacked hope. After centuries of inventing increasingly creative ways to kill each other, medieval soldiers finally paused and asked a rare, thoughtful question. What if we didn't die right away? The answer was the Pavis shield, a piece of equipment that marks the moment medieval warfare briefly flirted with self-preservation. The Pavisi wasn't a shield in the heroic sense. You didn't charge with it. You didn't duel with it. You didn't look impressive holding it. It was large, rectangular, and about as elegant as a wooden door ripped off its hinges. But it worked, and that made it beautiful in a very practical medieval way. Designed primarily for crossbowmen, the pavase was essentially a portable wall. Soldiers planted it into the ground, crouched behind it, and used it as cover while reloading. A process that took long enough for an enemy archer to finish a prayer, loose a shot, and reconsider their career. Without cover, reloading was a gamble. With a pavis, it became survivable. These shields were often tall enough to protect the entire body and sometimes curved slightly to deflect incoming missiles. Many were painted with symbols, city crests, or religious imagery because nothing says, "Please protect me," like a saint watching over your reload cycle. The pavis changed battlefield behaviour. Crossbow units became more disciplined, more stationary, and more lethal. Instead of firing once and running, they could hold ground, reload safely, and keep pressure on advancing enemies. This frustrated knights immensely, which in medieval warfare was often the goal. Of course, the pavise came with downsides. It was heavy, awkward, and absolutely not something you wanted to carry uphill while arrows were flying. Soldiers assigned to carry pavises were basically medieval interns, vital, underappreciated, and constantly wondering how their life choices led here. Still, the pavia represents an important shift. Medieval warfare began to acknowledge that survival mattered. Protection wasn't just armour anymore, it was positioning, teamwork, and the willingness to hide behind a very large piece of wood. The pavis wasn't flashy, it didn't inspire songs, but it saved lives, which in medieval warfare was revolutionary. Once medieval warfare discovered fire, things escalated quickly. Fire didn't care about armour, rank, training or confidence. Fire simply arrived and announced that everyone's plans were cancelled. It was the most democratic weapon medieval armies ever used, and they loved it for that reason. Fire weapons came in many forms. Flaming arrows, burning pitch, and pots of oil were set alight and hurled over walls. If it could burn and could be thrown, medieval armies tried it at least once, sometimes twice, just to be sure. The goal wasn't always destruction. Often it was panic, and fire was very good at that. Flaming arrows were less about accuracy and more about chaos. One arrow landing on a thatched roof could turn a quiet town into a screaming maze of smoke and confusion. Suddenly, defenders weren't guarding walls. They were desperately trying to stop their own homes from disappearing behind them. Fire didn't need to kill you directly, it just needed to make you abandon your position. Burning pitch was worse. Thick, sticky, and stubbornly committed to staying on fire. Pitch clung to wood, walls, and anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. Once ignited, it refused to be put out easily. Water laughed at it. Sand helped sometimes. Panic did nothing except make it spread faster. Then there was Greek fire, the stuff of legend, a mysterious incendiary weapon that burned even on water, terrified enemies, and ensured that nobody who faced it ever forgot the experience. Exact formulas were closely guarded, which is medieval, for no one wanted this used on them. Later, firearms worked best psychologically. Flames lit up the night. Smoke choked the air. The sound alone, crackling, roaring, collapsing structures, drained morale faster than any blade. Soldiers broke ranks. Commanders lost control.